welcome everyone to Beyond the Crucible, the podcast that dares to talk about setback and failure, but not so we can commiserate, so we can elevate. I'm Gary Schneeberger, the co-host of the show, and our mission today is to offer you the hope that your crucible experiences, those tragedies and challenges you faced or are facing at this moment, don't define you. Instead, they refine you. They did not happen to you, they happened for you. And no one I know knows that better. And trust me, I've done the research. No one I know knows that better than the founder of Beyond the Crucible, the host of the program, my friend Warwick Fairfax. Warwick, we have another interesting dialogue conversation between the two of us where I'm going to do a lot of questions asking and you're going to do a lot of question answering.
Well, yes, definitely looking forward to this one.
Yeah, this listener is another of the episodes that we call Stories from the Book Beyond the Crucible. This is where we take some of the folks that Warwick wrote about in his Wall Street Journal bestseller that came out in 2022. We take some of the individuals he wrote about in that book and we unpack parts of their stories, single slices of their stories that will help you navigate crucibles and lead a life of significance. The one that we're going to do this week is particularly timely because as you're hearing this, as we're recording this, we're just a few weeks away from Christmas. And Christmas is the celebration of the birthday of the birth of Jesus. And today we're going to talk about Jesus, specifically as Warwick talks in the book about Jesus, what he can teach us all about the subject of servant leadership. Warwick, I'll start the questions by saying, again, common to talk about Jesus at this time of year because of Christmas. But let's start by talking about who Jesus was and the impact he had. Let's level set the playing field so folks know who is this Jesus that these guys are talking about.
Just a bit of historical context. Jesus was born, we believe, around 4 to 6 BC in Bethlehem. That's just outside of Jerusalem in what was then the Roman-occupied Judea. So his parents, Joseph and Mary, they fled Egypt. At the time, King Herod, he had heard a story about the Messiah was coming, and so being one to protect his power, he decided in a very horrific way that he would kill all infant boys. And so Jesus' parents fled to Egypt. They later came back to their hometown of Nazareth, and then Jesus grew up in Nazareth for the next 30 years. So after that, and this is obviously pretty familiar to a lot of folks, Jesus lived there till he was about 30 years old in Nazareth, and then he began his ministry that lasted 3 years. He talked about God and his kingdom and urged people to change the way they lived. 3 years later, he was crucified by the Roman authorities. He antagonized the religious leaders of his day, teaching that he was the Messiah, and they certainly felt challenged in his teaching. So that's probably familiar certainly to many, but that's the historical Jesus. You may believe he's the Son of God or not, but that, there is a historical Jesus, and that's who he was and how he lived. Let's talk about Jesus' impact in history. It's been said by many historians that the Christian faith was a significant factor in the growth of Western civilization. Again, whether you think that was a good or bad thing, Jesus was who he said he was or not, historians over the years have typically said that Christianity had a significant factor in the growth of Western civilization. What is less well known is the growth of Christianity in the first 300 years. Rodney Stark, in his great book, The Rise of Christianity, noted in several years after Jesus' death to about 350 AD, the number of followers of Jesus grew from about 1,000 to just more than half of the 60 million people that lived in the Roman Empire. And so that's a growth rate of about 40% per decade. That's a massive growth. And we're going to talk more in this podcast about what were some of those factors. And there's going to be one particular factor that we're going to hone in on. But I just wanted to level set us about who Jesus was and the impact he had on Western civilization and certainly in the Roman Empire the first 300 years after he died.
Yeah, and that's a wise thing to do when we prepared to record this show this morning. That was your idea to sort of, a lot of times, especially at Christmas time, we assume everybody knows right, who the historical Jesus was and why we're celebrating. And there's a whole bunch of assumptions made there. So it's great to be able to pinpoint some things that will help what is going to follow now, this conversation about the one aspect of Jesus that you unpack the most in your book, and that is servant leadership. And my first question to you on that subject is, how did Jesus indeed model servant leadership? And maybe a little bit about what servant leadership is, right? What is it and how did Jesus model it?
Servant leadership, indeed humility, was very countercultural at the time. Somebody I actually know, John Dixon, wrote a book, Humilitas, and he's a historian and a Christian leader in Australia. And basically his thesis that the word humilitas, humility, it didn't exist at the time. Basically, anything like that word meant humiliation. So basically the culture at the time in the Greek and Roman culture was all about strength. It was about power. It was about being number one, crushing your enemies. The idea of the meek shall inherit the earth servant leadership made no sense. Those are for losers. Winners dominate. Winners control. Winners overthrow. That's the culture of the Greek and Roman world that Jesus was born into and grew up in. And so,
it's also true.
Go ahead.
It's also true. And again, the purpose of this podcast today is not to proselytize about the Christian faith, but it's also true of some of his own followers. They thought the same thing. They were not thrilled when he came back, not as a conquering hero with a flaming sword, right? I mean, it's certainly the cultural prevalence, but even among people who were led to follow him, some of them still wanted him to be that kind of leader.
Absolutely right, Gary. At the time, the way that his followers and the Jewish people of the day looked at the scriptures, they thought of the long-promised Messiah that's in Isaiah and a number of other scriptures. They thought of the Messiah as going to be some conquering hero. And at the time, they viewed the Roman Empire as their oppressors, their occupiers, who were occupying the then state of Judea. So when Jesus comes along and says, "My kingdom is not of this world," and he was more concerned about spreading the kingdom of God, but more into people's hearts, he was not against freedom at all, but his focus was on changing the hearts of men and women. That is not what the people of his day, the oppressed, the Jewish people, wanted to hear. It was not at all the Messiah that they thought was coming. So that was sort of a disappointment in a lot of ways. And when you look at his life, it was a life of service. One of the passages worth focusing on, it's one of the most famous passages in the Bible, is Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5-7. It's so prominent that many leaders, even of other faiths, have really admired this passage. Gandhi, who was the driving force behind the independence of India from Britain in 1947, this is one of the passages he most admired. So let's just look at some of the words in there, because it really dovetails into this whole concept of servant leadership. Beginning in Matthew 5, let's read some of the key elements. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. This whole idea of blessed are the meek, I mean, that just makes no sense, at least in today's world, and certainly then. So, one of the capstone of Jesus' life is in John 13, and it's one of the greatest examples of servant leadership. Jesus had spent his whole ministry teaching about the kingdom of God and healing the sick and the infirm. He spent his whole life caring for people. So in this incredible example in John 13, Jesus knows that this was going to be his last night on earth before he was crucified. And so he takes off his outer clothing, wraps a towel around his waist, and washes his disciples' feet. And then he says to his disciples, basically, now that I have done this, you should do likewise. I mean, one of them, Peter said, well, don't do this to me. I mean, he just felt like leaders don't do things like this. He just couldn't process it. So can you imagine a Roman emperor or any of the religious leaders of any of the different religions in that day doing something like that? It's just unheard of. So that concept of servant leadership, it may not seem quite as revolutionary today, but it was back then. It was extraordinary. It was new. It made no sense to many people, maybe even most people.
Right. And the example you gave of washing the disciples' feet, right? It's important to remember the cultural context of that. These guys walked around with sandals on or no shoes on. Those were not the typical dirty feet inside Nikes, right? I mean, they were, I mean, there was, 12 followed him. He washed all of their feet. It was not a pleasant job. It was truly a dirty job. That was the level of service that this Messiah King brought to the table. Warwick, I thought it was funny, not funny in an interesting way. You brought up Gandhi. I found a quote that Gandhi said about servant leadership. He says, the best way to find yourself is to lose yourself in service to others, which, sort of speaks to the quote that you use often when you talk about Gandhi's view of Christianity and Christians.
Yeah, no, that is a great quote, to lose yourself in service of others. I mean, that's what Jesus and his early disciples did. They spent their whole life serving a higher cause and serving others, and never once big noting themselves. Any time that in, the New Testament, when people would say, hey, Paul, Silas, we think you're sort of gods or you have these miraculous powers, they would just, which was culturally appropriate at the time, they would tear their clothes and just say, no, I'm not a god, don't worship me. It's like they just would cringe from any kind of adulation. We're just here as servants. Any adulation or fame was completely deflected because that was the model they saw from Jesus. He was all about his Father's work. It was all about the mission. It was not about him. And so, yes, no wonder Gandhi thought that was remarkable. And it was.
All this talk about what people expected of a Messiah, of a leader, not to be a servant leader. And then you preface this by level setting us on Jesus's life and his impact on the world in which he came to live. It reminds me, it occurs to me as I'm sitting here, it reminds me of what I say about public relations, that there are three ways to make news, that there are three. The easiest way, which doesn't last that long, it doesn't make the greatest impact, is to meet expectations. That's this king coming in and being the kind of king that takes over, big sword, violence, getting his way. There's exceeding expectations. That can get more noteworthy, and that's maybe why people like Caligula are more noteworthy, because they were really, really violent in the way that they did things. They exceeded expectations as terrible as those expectations were. And the best way to, as I say, commit news is to upset expectations. And what you described as the growth of the world after Jesus was on the scene, he he upset expectations. That was not what people expected. A servant leader was not what people expected. And look at the impact that had. Look at the quote unquote news, the good news that made for the world we live in.
Boy, that is such a fantastic point, Gary. I think it's worth dwelling on this for another moment. And you know way more about public relations than I do, but I would say in the history of public relations,
yes,
there's never been a leader who's upset expectations more than Jesus. Because people have been looking forward to the Messiah for hundreds of years, and he was so not what they wanted, at least what many people. He wasn't about overthrowing the Romans. He was about changing people's hearts. Again, he wasn't against freedom at all, but he was focusing on freeing the heart, if you will. So, he was a disappointment to many, but yet he disappointed many at the time. But look at the lasting impact he's had in the 2,000 plus years since. So yes, probably the greatest upset of expectations in the history of public relations, wouldn't you say, Gary? At least in your expert opinion.
And the greatest example with the longest contrail. I mean, that's still going on today. There are people who have just heard some of the things we've been talking about here for the last 15 minutes or so, who maybe hadn't thought about it in those ways before. So the impact of upsetting expectations by being a servant leader, Jesus, that's still going on today. And here's the next question, because I want you to go. It's not right. Jesus does this, yes, to help those he's come to save, but he also does this as a model to us. So what does what Jesus did in upsetting expectations, being a servant leader, what does that teach us about putting others ahead of ourselves? How can we model that in our day-to-day lives?
We live in a different time, but yet in some ways it's not that different. There is this sense that the strong prevail over the weak. It's all about number one, money, power, fame, adulation, whether it's Hollywood, politics, business, my way or the highway. That tends to be more common than maybe the alternative. And so Jesus' approach is still very countercultural. It sounds good in some ways, but when push comes to shove is who are the leaders that succeed? Who are the leaders that get chosen? It's often the larger than life. It's all about me, follow me and, adulate, worship me. But Jesus shows us a different way, the way of service, the way of others before self, the thought of a higher purpose, an others first agenda. Not looking to lord it over others. So when you look at Jesus' approach, before dismissing it, forget morality for a moment. I guess the question I would pose to folks is, was it effective? And I would say very effective. Arguably saying that Christianity had one of the biggest influences in the growth of Western civilization. Look at the growth in numbers of people who were followers of his in the first few hundred years after his death. That was incredibly effective. And, really Jesus' approach, servant leadership, others focused, it works. Part of the reason behind the growth in the numbers of Christians in those first few hundred years is there were 2 or 3 plagues that decimated significant portions of the population. There was no antidote. There was no cure. And Christians would come alongside people, whether they were believers of Jesus or not, and care for them at great risk to their lives. And people were astonished by why would they do this? They were living out their philosophy of servant leadership. It's not something you could ignore. It's like, who are these people? It was just, you didn't do that back then. If you saw somebody in trouble, you walked on the other side of the street. That was what you did. That was the same thing. There was no compassion and it wasn't part of the culture. So I think when you look at today, people want to work for leaders that care about them, that are humble and authentic, that put the interest of the team before themselves. And, ask yourself, who would you rather work for? A my way or the highway kind of leader, somebody who will, crush you if it benefits them, or a leader that serves a higher purpose, that wants to uplift you, help you be the best that you can be, wants to serve you, care for you, proverbially, wash your feet, so to speak. What kind of leader would you like to work for? For most people, it's pretty obvious. Most of us don't want to be dominated, crushed, and lorded over. We want to be cared for, respected, and uplifted. And that's what Jesus did, and that's what servant leadership does. So I think we can learn a lot from Jesus, irrespective of who you think he is or was. The way he lived his life and the impact it had on Western civilization, the impact it had on the Roman Empire in the first few hundred years after his death is undeniable. So servant leadership is something, even irrespective of morality, if you want to be an effective leader and have people follow you, it's something you should seriously consider.
Yeah. And if you want to bounce back from a crucible, right? I mean, here's some quotes. I pulled a couple more quotes. Booker Washington said this: if you want to lift yourself up, lift up someone else, right? You're in the midst of a crucible. You want to lift yourself up, lift up someone else. Ralph Waldo Emerson said a similar thing. Poetic, because he's a poet. It's one of the most beautiful compensations of life that no man can sincerely try to help another without helping himself. Serve, and thou shalt be served. So it really is applicable, this idea of servant leadership, to helping you move beyond. And I've heard you talk about it many times. Moving beyond your crucible, get your eyes off yourself, put your eyes on others. That helps you move through your setback and failure and trauma and tragedy, right?
Yeah, it's an excellent point, Gary. It really is. Certainly in my life, as listeners know pretty well by now, bouncing back from the loss of a $2.25 billion company, 150-year-old family media business in Australia under my watch, very devastating. I've found in my life, and many of the, in fact, most, if not all of the guests on our podcast, Beyond the Crucible, have found when they're serving others, serving a purpose, a cause beyond themselves, there is some degree of healing. In fact, a high degree of healing. And when you're caring for others, we talk a lot about a life of significance. And, and that's really, we talk a lot about, why do we talk about that all the time? Well, A, because we think that's what life should be about. But when you look at what pretty much every human wants is joy and fulfillment. How do you get joy and fulfillment? You could talk to any psychologist, I'd say any of the major religions, and they will all agree, and they don't always agree on a lot, but they will agree on this, that joy and fulfillment don't come from money, power, crushing, and dominating other people. Humans are not wired that way. Joy and fulfillment comes when you're serving other people, some other-centered purpose. That's where true joy and fulfillment comes from. So as you're trying to bounce back from your crucible, if you're focused on serving others, often how can I use what I've been through? How can the ashes of my crucible present a vision to care for other people? That will often lead to a vision that is others-focused, and it provides some purpose to the pain in some sense, some reason for living. There's nothing quite so motivating as a cause based on some higher purpose, serving others. It just, it's like food for the soul. It sort of soothes the wounds. So there's no question that, an other-centered purpose, it can definitely be healing for a crucible. It doesn't solve all the pain. It doesn't make the scars go away necessarily, but it does help you get through the next day and find a reason for living, finding something you can get out of the bed in the morning and feel good about, feel like my life has purpose. I know why I'm here. That's a great gift.
I sort of stole my rambling there, sort of teased the next question about how is servant leadership critical to leading a life of significance. I think you covered most of that, but is there anything else you want to say about that?
I think if you want to lead a life of significance, which we define as a life on purpose dedicated to serving others, you can't, even that can be twisted. I mean, humans are creative. You can even twist that into, hey, it's all about my vision, my passion. We're going to help people my way, and if we have to break a few eggs in the process of helping people, so be it. There are some who approach even, so-called good things that way. But the reality is, if you want people to work for you, you've got to respect them. You've got to, as I think I say in my book, you've got to give people the keys to the kingdom. You've got to give people the chisel on the Michelangelo's statue of David in Florence. You've got to say, hey, this is kind of what I'm thinking, but I'd love your input into the vision. I'd love, I need your help. How can I serve you? How can I make sure that, you see yourself in what we're doing? That sense of servant leadership and including people and lifting them up, it's critical, because if you want your vision to succeed, and you feel like this will really help a lot of people and serve a higher purpose, that's not going to happen unless you have a team of dedicated fellow travelers, as we call them, a team of dedicated followers in some sense. That will only happen if they feel cared for and respected. And so for that to happen, servant leadership is really critical. So you believe in your vision, you believe the world needs it, this is the change the world needs. You better embrace servant leadership if you want it to truly happen in the fullest sense of what could be possible.
Here's another quote I dug up that gets exactly to the point that you're talking about. Albert Pine, I should probably know who Albert Pine is. I do not. Albert Pine said this, though, and it goes right off of what you were just saying there. What we do for ourselves dies with us. What we do for others and the world is and remains immortal, right? That's that legacy piece of moving beyond your crucible, about living a life of significance that you talk about all the time. So we're kind of at the end of this very interesting discussion. And again, as always, things pop in our heads that we weren't expecting to pop in our heads, which is always fun. But as we wrap, Warwick, what's the big takeaways? What are the big takeaways of Jesus's example of servant leadership and his exhortation of servant leadership? What do you think are the big takeaways for folks from what we've been talking about?
I think people may disagree about who Jesus was or is. Was he the Son of God? Was he the Messiah? Certainly at the time, a lot of Jewish people felt like he wasn't the Messiah they were looking for as they read the scriptures. And today, not everyone will be followers of Christianity or accept Jesus as their Lord and Savior. And we get that. I understand. But I guess what we're focusing on here is this example of Jesus' life, and in particular, the aspect of his life that we are focusing on here is servant leadership. And we think it gives us a lot to learn from. And just think about the movement that Jesus started, with a handful of followers who were servant leaders in turn, that generated still more servant leaders, to the fact that more than half of the Roman world were identified as Christians. And in subsequent centuries had a massive impact on the growth of Western civilization. So I guess leaving aside who Jesus was and is, was he the Son of God? Is he the Son of God? Is he the Messiah? You may or may not have accepted Jesus as your Lord and Savior. Leaving that aside for a moment, clearly I think the path of others before self, the path of servant leadership, it works, and it's well worth respecting and emulating. So obviously, both Gary and I believe as we head into the Christmas season, the day of Jesus' birth, December 25th, at least when we celebrate it, yes, we believe that Jesus was and is the Son of God, and is worthy of emulating and believing in the whole sense of that word. But whether or not you're where Gary and I are, everybody has the right to choose their own path. I think it's worthy of looking at the life of Jesus, and in particular this aspect of servant leadership and how he treated other people and how successful it made his movement. So in your organization, in your nonprofit, emulating Jesus' servant leadership, to me, it makes sense. You want to fulfill some higher purpose. You want to make a difference in the world. There's a lot to learn from the man of Jesus and how he led his life. And so that's really why we're focusing on servant leadership. That's why we're focusing on Jesus' life. Whether or not you believe he is or was the Son of God, I think that there's a lot we can learn from Jesus and how he led his life.
And that, folks, is the last word on the subject. I've been in the communications business long enough to know that. And besides, Warwick just mentioned, as he was saying all that Christmas is coming. This is the last fresh new episode of the show before Christmas, which is why I put on if you're watching on YouTube, I put on my Superman Santa hat to ring in the season here. So thank you, listener, for spending time with us here as Christmas gets close. We do encourage you to learn the lessons that we've talked about here. We understand, as Warwick pointed out, that some topics are more close to the hearts of some listeners than others. But the examples that Warwick's unpacked in this episode, I think, are truly important, and as evidenced by the wide range, the wide array of people whose quotes I've read. So until the next time we're together, which will be after the new year, when we're together in a brand new episode, please remember, we do know your Crucible experiences are hard. We know they can be especially hard around Christmas time. But we also know this: the crucibles that have happened to you, that are maybe happening right now, are not the end of your story. In fact, if you apply the lessons that you learn in those crucibles to your life, it can be the best chapter of the new story you're writing, because where it leads to is what we've been talking about here, and that is a life of significance. Merry Christmas. If you enjoyed this episode, learned something from it, we invite you to engage more deeply with those of us at Beyond the Crucible. Visit our website, beyondthecrucible.com, to explore a plethora of offerings to help you transform what's been broken into breakthrough. A great place to start? Our free online assessment, which will help you pinpoint where you are on your journey beyond your crucible and to chart a course forward. See you next week.